All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our restoration webinar. Today we have Maddie Goebel with us from University of Idaho Extension Forestry. A couple quick reminders. On July 24th, we have our next webinar, which will be featuring Brad Stokes of University of Idaho Extension, and he'll be talking about best management practices for restoring pollinator ecosystems. But without further ado, I will let Maddie take over and start talking about fire as a restoration tool in Idaho forests. If you guys have any questions along the way, go ahead and put it in the chat box and we will get to them as we see them. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Is that showing up right on your end? Okay, great. Yeah, so as Lauren said, my name is Maddie Goebel. I'm an associate extension educator with University of Idaho Extension Forestry. I've been in the position for almost 2 years now, and I'm based in Moscow on the U of I campus. And so today, Lauren and Eric, who have been running this webinar series, asked me to talk about fire and restoration. And so with my background and the work that I do, I'm going to focus on fire in the context of forest restoration. There we go. Okay, so Idaho has about 21 million acres of forested land across the entire state. And we can kind of separate that into three main types of forests. So in North Idaho, where Lauren and I are based, we see a lot of mixed conifer forests, including our state tree, western white pine. And historically, these forests have been fairly dense and experienced pretty infrequent but large fires. In central Idaho, the climate tends to be a bit more dry and warm, and so we see more species like ponderosa pine that are thick-barked and a bit more adapted to fire conditions. We see these stands of trees being less dense relative to North Idaho, and they've historically experienced higher frequency fires as well. And then moving south into Boise and below, we kind of get into the desert ecosystem. So hotter temperatures, it's very dry, and we see less of the traditional species we'd see in central and north Idaho in terms of trees, and move more into those desert style trees, so pinyon and juniper. Here is a map that sort of shows the different forest types across the state. So up in the Panhandle, you can see a bit more variety, including lodgepole pine, as well as ponderosa and Doug fir. But in contrast, if you look at southern Idaho, you see a lot of white, so not a lot of forested areas. And then in central Idaho, we see mostly lodgepole pine and ponderosa as well. So moving away from forestry background, we'll talk a little bit about fire in Idaho. So much like many forests in the West, fire has always been a part of Idaho's forests, whether they be natural or human caused. Obviously, as time has progressed, we see more human influence in those fires. And fire has been really beneficial to these forests. It helps maintain forest health, particularly in those pine-dominated forests and in high elevation areas. These fires, as I mentioned before, in North Idaho specifically, were less frequent and low intensity ground fires, and this helps reduce vegetation in the understory and underbrush, and as well keeps forest density on the lower side. Fire also shapes species composition, structure, and resilience, affecting succession, the trees that return after fire, things like that. As well, we see that fire plays a role in nutrient cycling, regeneration, and habitat diversity. One event of note that sort of changed the way we deal with fire in the West and in Idaho was the Big Burn in 1910. This affected primarily Idaho and Montana and led to the enactment of really aggressive fire suppression policies. You might have heard about the 10 a.m. policy that the Forest Service created. And the goal with that was that if there was a fire one day, by the next day at 10 a.m., they were wanting that fire to be out. So, as a country and as a state, we really worked to eliminate fire entirely from the landscape. So I'll talk a bit now about fire regimes. So this talks about the way that wildfire varies in terms of frequency, seasonality, and intensity, and we would call that a fire regime. So in Idaho, we see two main groups of fire regimes, plus a third. I won't spend too much time on that, but with fire regime group one, we have frequent low intensity fires. So this tends to happen in, again, those ponderosa pine stands, in the drier mixed conifer forests, as well as in those lower elevation grasslands and rangelands. Frequency can range from 5 to 35 years. And we see this, just some examples of where you would see this fire regime around the Boise area in the southwest Idaho foothills, and then in those lower elevations in central Idaho, so around Payette and Salmon Chalice National Forests. We also have fire regime groups 3 and 4. So these are our more high intensity fires, and they're also less frequent compared to group 1. So we see this in more moist mixed conifer forests, lodgepole pine, we got a typo there, lodgepole pine stands, as well as in subalpine areas. And the severity of these fires can vary from kind of moderate to high. If we see high severity, that generally means a stand replacement. So kind of eliminating all the trees in a stand and restarting the process of regeneration in that area. While we're seeing more high intensity fires in this regime, they are less frequent, so 35 to 100 or so years. And this is the kind of fire we would have historically seen up in central and north Idaho, so in mountain ranges, including the Clearwater, Bitterroot, and Sawtooth. And then we've got this final regime group, group 5. This tends to happen at the really high elevations. So think the Lemhi Mountains, the high elevations of the Bitterroots. And these are areas that don't see a lot of fire and aren't as reliant on it as some of our other regions in the state. So this is a map that shows kind of just the variety of fire regimes across the country. It's a little bit blurry. I would have zoomed into Idaho, but I think the quality would have been even worse. But you can see in southern Idaho, we've got that tan color. So stand replacement fires, 35 to 100 years. And then moving up north, we see a mix of understory fires in that blue, and then more frequent stand fires as well in pink. So as we, as forest managers have removed fire from our activities in forests, we've seen some really dramatic consequences. So first, we have structural changes to forests. Our forests don't really look like they did, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, etc. We've got much more dense forests, more trees per acre, and as forests are more dense, we see more shade tolerant species. So trees that don't need as much sun as some others. So this is resulting in Doug fir encroaching on pine sites in the state. We have a loss of large, old fire-resistant trees, so trees that have withstood fires in the past. We don't see them as frequently anymore. And we have increased field connectivity. So there's a lot of understory vegetation, and horizontal connectivity is kind of the spacing of the trees as well. And this is just increasing potential for more severe fires and enabling ground fires to climb up into the crown. Much like the rest of the country, or particularly in the West, I suppose, we're seeing increased fire frequency and severity. I just highlighted a few here. We had one last year in the Orofino region, so Clearwater area. So fires are becoming more common, and the impacts they're having are a lot more extreme. We also see some ecological and social impacts of excluding fire from our forests. So we see a loss of habitat for some species of trees, including white bark pine and western larch. Uh, as a result, too, we see sedimentation in streams, which can affect drinking water. And maybe above all, coming from kind of a social science background myself, we have a lot more threat to communities in the wildland urban interface. And as the population of our state grows, this will be a continuing issue that we have to deal with. So moving away from that background in forestry and fire, I'll talk just a little bit about restoration. So I think it's helpful. Maybe this has been covered in previous webinars, but um, first we'll talk about landscape restoration. So this is the process of rehabilitating and reconstructing damaged or degraded landscapes, and returning them to their original ecological functions and natural beauties. This is happening at large scales, even beyond state level. And then specifically calling down into forest restoration. This is all the activities that help return a forest to a healthy state. This includes reforestation as well. And some of these activities include controlling invasive species, whether those are trees that we're not used to seeing in the forest types across our state, or um, something more like weeds, like cheatgrass or something like that. Restoration in forests helps us maintain tree diversity and allows us to return forest composition and structure to a more natural state. So in this case, that would be what our forests used to look like before we played a large role in removing fire from these ecosystems. And we also would include pruning and managing underbrush as well as part of restoration. So just an example of some specific activities that would fall under forest restoration, not only including fire, but we will focus on that. So we have prescribed fire, we have replanting or regeneration, we have erosion control techniques. We also have fire surrogate tools, so methods of restoration that don't include fire. So this could be mechanical thinning using a chainsaw, mastication, etc. Um, and yeah, while we're going to focus on fire in this talk, sometimes these fire surrogate tools are needed before we can go in and safely burn in stands, just due to the high density we've got in many of our forests across the state. A little tie-in to the Rangeland Center. Targeted grazing can be used as well to help reduce underbrush. And some of these fire surrogate tools, as I said, can be used before or in place of prescribed fire if the necessary resources aren't available. Why do we need to do restoration in our forests? Really, just the effects of more than a century of fire suppression have really changed the way our forests look and operate. So fires would help reduce fuel loads in our forests. And by eliminating fire, we've really just let our forest grow and grow and grow. So We've got more fuel in our forests. They're also denser. And we've lost sort of the original structural diversity of our forests. So that's referring to the various vertical plants and trees that we have in our forests. And then as well, we previously, our forests were a lot more resilient to fire. If we think about ponderosa pine, it's adapted to fire with very thick bark that can be up to 3 inches thick. We also have lodgepole pine, whose cones, we call them serotinous, and they must reach a certain temperature in order to open and release their seeds. So, by removing fire from those landscapes, our trees aren't as resilient, and we've created landscapes that are much more fire prone. Restoration not only returns our forests to kind of their original natural state, but would help us reduce wildfire damage as well as create more resilient forests. Why fire? Fire can kind of be a scary tool, I think, for a lot of people to think about. Um, as I've been saying, wildland fire is an important process across many ecosystems, and honestly, most ecosystems have some sort of relationship with fire. Uh, we're at a point where we have such large swaths of land that need to be treated. The mechanical methods that I mentioned a couple slides ago, so mastication, mechanical thinning, logging, those aren't the most effective or efficient way to restore forests at a landscape scale. On private land, a couple acres, that might be a method that would work. But fire is going to be a more efficient method of really improving our forest health. And so ultimately, the goal here is to restore fire to regain its natural role in our forest ecosystem. So not only do we want to restore our forests, but we would love to restore fire as part of that overall ecosystem process. So we've got two major reasons to bring fire back into our landscapes. First and foremost, reducing fuels and fire hazards. So uh, simply put, using fire to fight fire. So using prescribed burning and other methods of fire and restoration to reduce fuel continuity, so create breaks in fuel to help fire from spreading, as well as reducing the potential for crown fires. So um, tree fires generally start on the ground or surface fires, and because we've got so much fuel, and intermediary trees and vegetation, it makes it really easy for fires to move up into the crown and spread much faster. And then again, restoring fire as an ecological process. So fire is really built into our forest ecosystems and promotes natural regeneration and promotes species diversity. Some other reasons, maintaining existing vegetation. You might also use fire to prepare a site for further restoration or replanting. Reducing woody plant density, again, some of that underbrush and other materials in the forests, and improving wildlife habitat. So I'm going to talk about two main applications of fire and restoration. So that includes prescribed fire and managed wildfire. So prescribed fire, it's the intentional reintroduction of fire to an ecosystem and or landscape. This tends to be done at smaller scales, so 10 to hundreds of acres. And prescribed and prescription are the key words here. So it's very intentional burning that only occurs under certain fuel and weather conditions. The goals of prescribed burning include reducing fuels, species regeneration, and again, restoring historical fire regimes. And as I mentioned before, we've got several considerations before we do engage in prescribed burning. This includes weather, so a high or a low humidity day, high wind, really dry weather is not great conditions for prescribed burning. You'd also want to consider timing and seasonality, as weather can kind of vary between seasons. You'd also want to consider fuel moisture. So if the area you're trying to burn is super dry, probably not a great time to burn. And then obviously the safety of the individuals performing the prescribed burn. Is it a time that is kind of conducive to safe burning? And then we have managed wildfire. So this is basically allowing a wildfire to burn naturally in an area where the threat of spread is lower. So it's kind of based off this let burn strategy, and you see it mostly in wilderness areas and more remote terrain. Obviously, in places that are close to human populations, managed wildfire is not a tool that managers will use. So, yeah, and in order to allow for managed wildfire, much like prescribed burning, there are certain conditions that must be met. So weather, fuels, and terrain all must be moderate. They can't be overly challenging to navigate. And so when conditions permit, managed wildfire can allow managers to try to address multiple objectives that they might have in a specific area. Obviously, human safety is paramount, but there are other reasons to allow a fire to burn, many of which we've discussed kind of previously in this presentation. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of challenges and things to consider when using fire as a restoration tool. There are social barriers. I think this is improving, especially in Idaho. People, I think, are starting to understand the benefits of prescribed burning more and more. Um, but there is the risk of fire escaping that I think people are often afraid of, as well as health concerns related to smoke. I'm sure we all remember, as I've gotten the photo here, the kind of post-apocalyptic conditions we saw in New York City, which is really interesting on the East Coast. We're a little more used to that out west, but yeah, it's something that more and more people are experiencing. We also have some ecological limits. So because we've not used fire in a lot of our forests, we've got invasive species. So a great example is cheatgrass, which is highly flammable. So finding ways to adapt to that challenge are important. And maybe most importantly or most obviously, climate change. So we've got warmer and drier conditions that are not only creating, increased fire severity and frequency, but are limiting the windows for prescribed burning and ultimately increasing fire danger. And then again, we've got altered fuel structure. So the way that our forests are composed and the structure of them is changing the way that fuels are arranged as well. We also have legal and policy considerations on anything having to do with work in our forests and our rangelands, our environment in general, are subject to some government requirements. So whether that's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, or air quality regulations, especially when it comes to smoke. There are funding limitations. Again, this is not limited to forestry and fire by any means. Um, One of the more challenging aspects, I think, to using fire and restoration is coordinating between landowners. So, federal, state, tribal, private landowners may not all have the same goals in mind when wanting to bring fire back into their management style or whether or not they want to bring fire in at all. And then there's a need for trained personnel. This is improving over recent years. That logo in the bottom right corner is the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange. So they put on workshops across the country, trying to build up our population of folks who are educated on the techniques of prescribed burning and how to do it safely. So some opportunities for involvement. We've got the Idaho Prescribed Fire Council. The president or leader of the council is Heather Heward. She's a professor at University of Idaho based up in Moscow. This is open to citizens. You don't have to be an agency employee or a university employee or anything like that. We also have the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. So if you're interested in learning more about the research and kind of more technical information surrounding fire and restoration, this is a good resource. I'm not sure where everyone's from, but this is part of a larger joint fire science program, and they have different regions across the state with similar networks. And then lastly, we've got Idaho Firewise. So this is a nonprofit that I am on the board of. They do a lot of great work trying to promote fire safety in communities. And so if you're interested in joining that group, feel free to reach out to me. We're kind of in a state of transition right now, but we do a lot of great work, and it's an important mission. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions. I've got my contact info here as well. If you have any further questions or don't want to ask it in the chat, that would be fine. But yeah, thanks for your attention, everyone.
All right, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Thanks again for that great talk, Maddie. It's greatly appreciated that you're able to help us out. We are always looking for more ways to understand fire and why it is a good thing as well, and how it can be used for restoration purposes. Maddie and I are both members of the Extension Forestry team. I'm based up in Benoit County, but we get some of the more popular questions we always get are about fire. So we wanted to provide an avenue for folks to ask questions about any restoration aspects of it. I'm not seeing any questions, which means that Maddie did an excellent job and hopefully answered all of them that you guys might have. Or like she said, feel free to reach out to her via email or phone. And as a reminder, our next one or next restoration webinar is going to be on July 24th, which will be featuring University of Idaho Extension educator Brad Stokes on best management practices for restoring pollinator ecosystems. And that should be another really good talk. And we're excited about that one. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Lauren.